Let's break down what we'll be covering. First, we're going to build user registration endpoint. Here, users will send a post request to register. The required parameters include full name, email, phone number, driving license number, password, and confirm password. Upon successful registration, the API will respond with the user details, a status code of 201, and a success message. Secondly, we're going to build user login endpoint. The user will send a post request with email and password. And for a successful login, the API will respond with an access token, a status code of 200, and a success message. Now let's jump into Visual Studio. We'll start by adding repositories, both interfaces and implementations for users. Go to domain layer and add a user's repository interface. Inside this repository, add a method for persisting data in the database during the registration. Call it createUserAsync method and pass the application user and secured password as parameters. This method should return a task with identity result. Please note that we'll be implementing these methods asynchronously to enhance performance. We also need a method for checking if user with a given email address exists. Now create getUserByEmailAsync method and pass email as a parameter. This will return the user if found or null if the user does not exist. When logging, we want to check if the given password is valid for the specified user. Add validate user with password async method and pass the application user and secured password as parameters. This method returns a boolean indicating if the password matches the one stored for the given user or not. To be able to assign users to role, we need to create add user to role async method and pass application user and role name as parameters. So to get the roles assigned to the specified user, create get roles for async method and pass application user as parameter. This method will return a list of roles for the given user. So to implement these interfaces, go to the data layer. Inside repositories folder, add users repository class. We need to leave it as internal and implement a users repository. First, make all methods async. And then we need to inject user manager from the constructor and pass application user as user type. If you have watched the previous video, you already know how to set up a ASP.NET Core identity, which gives us interfaces that we can use to manage users using user manager. Once you have done that, go to create user async method and add the code. So create the user with a given password. So we're going to use network credential to secure passwords in memory. So use the password property to get the plain text password. And then we need to return identity result, which shows if the user was created successfully or it failed. Now go to the getUserByEmailAsync method and type the following code. We're going to use user manager to find the user by the provided email and then return that user or null if the user was not found. In the validate user with password async method, add the following code. We will use this method during logging to validate the user with a given password. Return true if user was validated successfully or otherwise false. In add user to role async method, add the code to add the specified user to the named role. In the get roles for async method, add this code to use user manager to get roles for the specified user. Before adding rules and logics, let's define registration and login requests and responses. Go to the contracts layer, add authentication folder in the requests folder. Inside this folder, add register request. This request must have full name, email, phone number, driving license number, password, and confirm password. Inside the authentication folder, also add login request, and we need to pass email and password as properties for this request. We will use FluentValidation to validate these requests to ensure correct data is sent to the API. Now right-click on the contracts layer, go to the Manage NuGet packages and search for FluentValidation. So we need to install this package. In the validations folder, add register request validator, inherits from abstract validator from FluentValidation, and pass register request as type we wish to validate. In the constructor, set the following rules. We want to ensure all properties should not be null and do not allow empty. Email should be of type email address. Password must be at least 6 characters long. Also ensure password matches with confirmed password. So also add login request validator. We need to inherit from abstract validator and pass login request as type of validate. In the constructor, set the following rules. We need to ensure password and email are required and do not allow empty. So once we have all these two validators, we need to register them to be used with dependency injection. And we can only do this once. So go to the API layer and add all validators from contracts layer. Go to the API layer and add all validators from contract assembly. To do that, we need to define an empty interface in the contracts layer. So go to the contracts layer and add an empty interface. We can call it iContracts assembly marker. So use this interface to register all validators in the contracts assembly using validators from assembly containing, then specify that interface. To add responses that API will be sending back to the client, still in contracts layer, navigate to the DTOs folder and add user details DTO with the user information be sending as response. Let's say we want to send user ID, full name, email, phone number, driving license number, and list of roles assigned to this user. So we can do this. Also, we need to add token DTO. This will define access token, token type, and expiration period that the API will be sending as a response for a successful login. We need all our responses to have status code and message. So create a base class, call it API response that all the responses will inherit from. Now add user details response, inherits from API response. So use user details DTO to define our user information that we want to send as a response. Also note here that the user details can be null. We also need to add login response. Here, we also need to inherit from API response and use token DTO to store token data in the response. Also, the token object can be null. We also need to add validation error response. This also inherits API response. So this response is used to send validation errors. It is a dictionary where keys are property names and values are error messages. After successful logging, we want to send bearer token in the response. So create a service for generating access token. Go to the utility layer, under services folder, let's add interfaces folder and create a JWT generator service interface. Inside this interface, add generate token method and pass token config. So let's define this token configuration file. Go to the contracts layer, inside configurations folder, create token config and add user ID, full name, email, and list of roles as properties. This method returns token DTO, which contains access token, token type, and expiration period. To be able to generate access token, we need a secret key, audience, and issuer. Go to the API layer and in appsettings.json, add JWT section and specify key as any secret key. You can visit this website to generate long password to use as a secret key. Provide the issuer and audience. Now go to the contracts layer and add JWT option config class. Add these properties and specify the section name as JWT. To add JWT authentication in dependency injection, create a service collection extension in API layer and call it JWT authentication extension. Inside this extension class, create add JWT authentication static method. So pass iService collection as first parameter and iConfiguration as second parameter. Get JWT configuration from appsettings.json. We need to configure JWT option config for dependency injection. Add authentication scheme And finally, validate tokens during authorization. Ensure audience and issuer are valid. Validate token is not expired. Validate issuer signing key. Set audience, issuer, and symmetric security key from JWT option config. Now go back to program CS and add JWT authentication to the service collection and pass a configuration as argument. Down here, add use authentication and use authorization middlewares in this order. Now go back to the utility layer. Inside services folder, add JWT generator service and implement iJWT generator service. Inject JWT option config as I option from the constructor and get its value. In the generate token method, create symmetric security key using the secret key from the JWT option config. With this symmetric security key, initializes signing credentials instance, create token claims for email, full name, username, audience, issuer, and user roles. We need to set up the expiration period. Also set up the security token information using the claims as subject, audience, issuer, signing credentials and expiration time. Now creates JSON web token and convert to string. Finally, returns token DTO with token as access token, bearer as token type and expiration period. Now right click on the utility layer and add dependency injection class. Make this class static. Add a static method called add utility services and extend a service collection. Inside, add JWT generator service interface and its implementation as scoped service. Go to the API layer, open program CS and add utility services to the service collection, like so. Now that we have DTOs, requests and responses for user registration and logging, let's add some rules and logics in the application layer. Right-click Components folder and add Interfaces folder. Inside the interfaces, add a auth component interface. Make this class public. So inside the interface, add logging user async method. Pass login request as first parameter. The second parameter is the secured password. This method should return login response. Add another async method for registration called register user async. Here we need to pass register request as first parameter and secured password as second parameter. Now we need to implement this interface. So still in the components folder, add auth component class. Make this class internal as it will be accessed only in the application project. We need to implement a auth component inside the auth component class. First, before we start implementing, we need to inject a logger, a user repository, and iJWT generator service from the constructor. So to make sure that these services are not null, we're going to use null check helper.throw if null method. This method was created in the previous video. In the register user async method, we need to get the current method name. Since we are inside an asynchronous method, now go to the utility layer and in helpers folder, create utility helper static class. Add a static method to get the current method name using column member name attribute. Use this helper method to get the current method name. Declare user details response instance and pass internal server error as default error code. So inside the try block, check if user exists with the provided email. If user exists, set the message and status code as conflict and return the response immediately. If user does not exist, we need to register that user. So assign the values like this manually and invoke the method to register the user. If user was created successfully, assign this user a default user role. Set the message as success and to one as status code. If user creation failed, get the errors from the identity result. Log the errors. This will be useful for debugging. In case of exemption, set the error response message and log the exemptions. Now moving on to login user async method. Also here, get the current method name using the helper method. We also need to declare login response instance and pass internal server error as a default status code. Check if user with the provided email address exists. If user does not exist, set an authorized message and status code and return response immediately. So use a user repository to validate the specified user with a given password. If user is valid, get roles assigned to this user. Generate access token using JWT generator service. Pass token config with these arguments. We have user ID, full name, email, and user roles. Set up the response as success and return the response. If user was not valid, just return an authorized response. So in case of exemption, set the error response message and log the exemptions. Now that we have the application layer service, we need to register. So right click on the application layer and add dependency injection class. Make this class static and add a static method called add application services. We need to extend iService collection in this method and add an auth component with its implementation as scoped service. That's not over. We need to go to the API layer and open program CS, add application services to the service collection. All right, so now that we have the application layer, we need to create the controllers. Go to the API layer and right click on the controllers folder. So select MVC controller empty and click add. Choose API controller empty. We need to name our controller auth controller and click add. So inside the controller, we need to inject an auth component from the constructor. And we need to use the helper method to ensure it's not null. Create register user async as a post method. The endpoint will be API stroke controller name. So the controller name is auth stroke register. So pass register request as first parameter and inject Fluent validator for register request from services as second parameter. So if it's not valid, convert validation errors to dictionary where keys are property names and values are error messages. Convert the dictionary to validation error response. So let's define a common response message that will be the same across all the controllers. So we only need to do this once. So in the API layer, under extensions folder, add response message extension class. Also make this class static. Inside this class, add a static response message method that should return an action result. Pass first parameter as controller base. Note the keyword this, which indicates that this is an extension of the controller base. The second parameter is response object. This is the object that will be sending to the API caller. And the third parameter is the status code. Create an instance of object result and pass response object in the constructor. Also specify the status code and content types. So finally, just return the object result. Now, go to the controller and return the response message by passing validation error response as response and bad request as status code. If the request validation result is valid, so use network credential to secure the plain text password like so. Discard the original plain text password by recreating the request. Try to register user by invoking register user sync method in auth component. Dispose the secured password from the memory. Return the iAction result using response message method as custom defined. Let's create a post method for logging user. Specify the endpoint as API, the controller name, which is auth stroke logging. So the first parameter is the login request, and the second parameter, we need to inject Fluent Validator for login request from the services. So in case the validation result is not valid, we need to convert the validation errors to dictionary where keys are property names and values are error messages. Convert the errors to validation error response and return the response message like so. If request validation result is valid, which means we don't have any issue with the login request. Also here we need to secure the user password. Discard the original plain text password by recreating the request like so. You can use the login user async method in the auth component to try to log in this user, dispose the secured password from the memory, and return the response message. So now build the solution, ensure nothing is broken. So run the application now. This will open Swagger UI. We will not be using Swagger UI but Postman. Copy the Swagger JSON URL and import to Postman like so. You can start testing the register API endpoint. Now let's test some validation. So we can start with sending request with no email address. And we get bad request response with the error message that the email is required. Send a request with password 4 characters long. So we get bad request response with the error message that the password should be at least 6 characters long. Send a request with password and confirm password not match. Here we get bad request response with the error message that password and confirm password should match. Send a valid request. Here we get 201 and a success message with the user details. This indicates that the user was registered successfully. Open the login API endpoint and do some tests. First, let's test the validation. So send request with no email address. Get bad request response with the error message that the email is required. Send a valid request with email that does not exist. Here we get an authorized response. Send valid request with email that exists with the correct password. Here we get a success response with access token. You can verify our JSON Web Token by visiting JWT.io website. Copy the access token and paste it in the encoded section. The token will be decoded and you can see the headers and payload with the claims we set for the user details. You can see we have the name here, we have the user ID, we have the roles, and also you can see the signature. Great. We have successfully developed register and login API endpoints.